these women have been through for over a decade, it doesn't really go far enough, in my view, in its recommendations in determining the appropriate redress mechanisms and levels of redress that are required. But importantly, within the report, it makes very clear suggestions now that the decision is ultimately now in Parliament's hands. So what we need to see next from government is the ability for Parliament to be able to debate this issue and to amend a motion, for example. It would be even better if the government puts forward its own proposals that we can amend as parliamentarians ourselves, so that we can get the outcome that these women deserve as quickly as possible. So that's another point of the report, is that redress is required urgently.
Well, except that we're talking, Steve Webb, I think, used the word eye-watering about what the compensation bill could end up at. If it was, the report is sort of suggesting it's up to about £3,000, £1,000 to £3,000, and that's just for the wrongdoing rather than putting things right, which is 3.5 to 10.5 billion. That doesn't even address what might be in compensation. What sort of figure do you think it would be?
Well, the All-Party Parliamentary Group, which is a cross-party group of MPs who've been campaigning on this issue, when we submitted our suggestions to the Ombudsman, we'd asked for, at the very least, level 6 compensation, which is around £10,000 and above. Now, obviously, what we've heard from the Ombudsman is that there's a suggestion of level 4, which is up to £3,000 worth of compensation. And I think it's ultimately going to be a question for Parliament to decide, but we've got to remember that over 3.8 million women who were born in the 1950s were essentially betrayed. They were denied pensions as a result of the government's failure to adequately communicate.
It's 36 billion.
Were plunged into poverty, and many have died in the last 5 years whilst waiting for justice.
But it's difficult, this, isn't it? Because that would come up with a bill of 36 billion. Now, some of these women will have known. They might not have been told as much as they should have done by the DWP, but they might have heard from the news, they might have planned accordingly, they might not need the money now. And there may be some young taxpayers who think, really?
I think ultimately many of these women, if not all of these women, were wrong. They couldn't financially plan for their futures adequately, and of course in any final scheme there would need to be allowances made for women who were told, were closer to the retirement age at a later stage, as opposed to those who were closer to the retirement age at a further away stage. And that would have to be quite detailed. But I think to deny women appropriate redress for the injustice that they have suffered would be wrong. And I wouldn't want Parliament to pick and choose women that it felt were deserving and undeserving. The women were betrayed. They couldn't financially plan for their future. And you've got to remember as well that these women were of the generation where we don't enjoy the same levels of equality that we do today. Many of them gave up work to bring up children and care for loved ones and family members. They didn't have the opportunity to plan through a private pension. So when they were told that their retirement age was changing, the rug was essentially pulled from under them because they hadn't planned for that change, and they didn't have the financial means to address that huge change in lifestyle.
Rebecca Long Bailey, thank you very much. Well, let's just turn now finally to Jane Cowley, who is a retired head teacher, was campaign director of WASPI, Women Against State Pension Inequality, and she joins us from Newcastle. Jane, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sarah.
How do you feel about the Ombudsman's report?
Well, I'm very, very pleased that at long last, it has been a very long time, we have a clear recommendation from the Ombudsman that WASPI women need to be getting some compensation for the injustices caused by the DWP's maladministration. It's been a long time coming, and we're very pleased to see that clear recommendation now.
Right. What is your understanding of how it will play out? I mean, I suppose the starting point is what would happen in Parliament.
Well, that's a very good question, Sarah, and I don't think anybody is quite clear on that answer at the moment. But, I mean, what the Ombudsman is saying is that really, rather than do what they would normally do, which is expect the department to put things right, that it is quite astonishing that the DWP has refused to accept responsibility for the maladministration. Parliament has sidestepped that by going straight to Parliament. Now, we've always had a huge huge amount of cross-party support with MPs from across the House coming forward and saying that WASPI women need to get compensation. And I think it's time for those MPs to begin to get together to work out how this can best be brought about as quickly as possible. One WASPI woman is dying every 13 minutes. So any delay means that some women will never see that compensation. It really does need to happen quickly.
We're talking about 3.5 million women.
Yes.
Do they all deserve compensation?
Well, I think they do. Every one of them is entitled to a state pension. Every one of them was not told that their state pension age would be changing.
But many of them will have known.
Some may have known. In terms of actually what we see on our social media, the number who actually knew is very tiny. Most women found out when the 2011 Act was passed and the DWP began writing at that point. And as Steve Webb has already said, it was only because we were informed about the 2011 Act that we then discovered the 1995 Act changes.
Right. Is it going to be an election issue?
I think it must be. Surely it must be. There are 3.6 million votes at play, and we
will
would
make
be
it an election issue.
That will make it an election issue.
Jane Cowley, thank you very much. Well, it's time for lunchtime. The Bank of England chose to leave interest rates unchanged at 5.25%. The 5th month in a row that they've been held steady. That's despite very good inflation data yesterday. Back in October 2022, inflation was above 11%, the highest rate for 40 years. It has, of course, since fallen, now down to 3.4% for February, and it's expected to fall further in the months ahead, down to the target of 2%. Faisal Islam is our economics editor, joins us from outside the Bank of England. And Faisal, there is, well, if not till this point, from now, huge pressure on the bank to cut rates.
There is, good afternoon, Sarah. There is. They've obviously chosen to not ignore that, but they have kind of acknowledged the idea that the direction of travel now is to cut rates. But we had an interesting statement accompanying the decision from the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, saying we're not yet at the point where we can cut interest rates. Not yet being obviously the crucial two words there, but things are moving in the right direction. The issue, as you point out, is that inflation is calming down. It's going to be below the government's target, probably in the next couple of months. We're officially still under the label of recession, even though that's probably over right now as we stand here in March 2024. And so there is that pressure from the unions, from some in business, from some backbench Conservative MPs that the bank should be moving more quickly. What they've done today is they had their normal vote. It's a committee of 9 members of the Monetary Policy Committee that vote for or against rate rises or cuts. The last time they met in February, there were 2 votes actually for rises and 1 for a cut, and the rest of the panel members chose to keep rates on hold. This time, nobody's voted for a rise. That's the first time that's happened since autumn 2021. So all in all, you get an incremental move towards rate cuts in the summer. It's like a tanker turning round. It takes a long time to change direction. What? Just one?
Still
that's
just
what
one.
Surprised some. Yeah, I think when you have a backdrop of recession, albeit a mild one, with inflation heading towards target, that's fairly low. But I think the next meeting is in May. That's when the bank recalculates where it thinks the economy is going to be, where inflation is going to be. And I think what they're looking at, or what it pains to point out, is that even as the headline rate of inflation goes below 2%, the things that they're worried about is what's happening in the service sector, restaurants, cafes, the financial services industry. And that's still, the inflation there still is running at 6%. They're going to be watching very carefully what happens to wage settlements as well in spring.
Now, with 1.6 million people coming off fixed-rate mortgages this year, those individuals are obviously going to be hoping that rates have fallen further by the time they're remortgaging. And I imagine there's a political push from that too.
Well, absolutely. We heard yesterday from the Prime Minister announcing a bounce back in the economy, a turnaround in the economy, even contemplating that famous phrase, green shoots. I mean, they won't say this, they're not physically trying to put pressure on the bank to cut rates, but they would just love it if rates were cut by the summer, 2 or 3 rate cuts before the general election. For them, I think it would signal to the public that things had started to turn around. Some of those rates are moving already, actually, in the mortgage market without the bank doing anything. So their words matter as much as their actions.
Faisal Islam, thanks very much. Now, it is more than 30 years since Alan Bennett and Nicholas Hytner first worked together. That was for a play at the National Theatre. In the years since, their writing and directing partnership has resulted in hits on stage and screen.
You're not St. John, are you?
St. John who?
The disciple of Jesus, that.
No, the name's Bennett.
They're clever, but they're crass.
You can't polish a turd. And now, for some poetry. Most of the stuff poetry's about hasn't happened to us yet. When it does, we'll have the antidote ready. Grief, happiness.
I wish you the best of health, Father.
Wish me. You wish me death, you plump little cuckoo.
The Lady in the Van, the History Boys, and the madness of King George there. Well, now they pair up again for Alan Bennett's first original screenplay in 40 years. It's called The Choral. It will be filmed this summer, and its director, Nicholas Hytner, joins us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
I mean, this, I think, will surprise many people and excite many people. How are you? Tell us about it.
Well, it excites me most of all. This is a screenplay that was first given to me by Alan 5 or 6 years ago as a kind of dramatic sketch. He wondered whether it was a play, but it struck me that it felt much more like a movie. It's set in a Yorkshire community, Milltown, and it's about the choral society there in 1916. Most of the men have volunteered for the front, so they're short of men, and somewhat reluctantly they go out and recruit teenagers to the choir. The chorus master then himself joins up, so they have to go to a particularly tricky, driven, sarcastic and brilliant chorus master who he's himself returned from Germany where his cookery has been. So it's a very, very rich mix of stuff, and it's about singing, music, the way music can bring a community together, and it's about what happens to young people, kids, when they know their time is limited because they're going to war. I think it has a resonance there.
Perhaps not surprisingly, signed up, I think, the actors who have already signed up for it. Simon Russell Beale, Jim Broadbent, Ralph Fiennes.
Yeah, that's how you get a movie made. You get the script is found immediately with film companies, but you always need to get a cast. And Ray Fiennes playing the chorus master, Jim Broadbent playing the chair of the choral society, and Simon Russell Beale making an appearance as Elgar. And I think that it's an ensemble piece. There will be lots of it.
What is it like working with Alan Bennett now? Because I think he's 89. You have worked together so much, as I set out in the introduction. From what I read in the Guardian this morning, in the Telegraph, sorry, your first meeting wasn't that great.
No, we're both quite shy. Neither of us great in social situations. So I was very, very nervous of saying something stupid. He thought I had no small talk. I do. And it took us working together for us to feel completely at ease with each other. Now, of course, it's absolutely fine. And he's no different now to what he was when I first worked with him in the late 80s, I guess. And still writes every day. Not always working on a play or a screenplay, but he's. It wouldn't surprise me if a short story was published in the next year or two. He is extremely productive.
Do you argue, bicker over how something should be portrayed or presented?
Occasionally, but we never do anything more than bicker. And particularly when you're making a film, it's the director who's there on the set, having to make the decisions moment by moment. In the theatre, he's regularly in rehearsal, so nothing gets changed. without it going through him. But he's the kind of writer who wants to give you a sketch, a first draft. He's very, very interested in feedback. There are different kinds of writers. Some give you a finished product. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just some won't let go of a work until they know it's absolutely watertight. Alan likes to collaborate.
Right. And much steelier, I think, than his reputation would suggest.
Oh, much steelier. He knows what he wants. He knows what he wants, and usefully, he knows where he doesn't know. And that's incredible. Push him down the wrong road. As soon as you try to push him down the wrong road, you know you're going down the wrong road, because he'll tell you.
And the material is as good now as it used to be? I mean, there isn't any let-up?
I don't think there's any let-up at all. And it's very moving to me that he has returned for this screenplay back to the Yorkshire that he wrote about in his very first screenplay, which was called A Day Out, back in the early 70s, about a bicycle club in 1914. He's now 1916 in the same Yorkshire. I can't say he remembers that Yorkshire, but his parents certainly did.
Okay, and just for an impatient audience, filming this summer, which means we're not going to see it for ages.
I imagine next year. That's not in my hands.
Nicholas Heitner, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, for the first time, the United States has submitted a draft resolution to the UN Security Council calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, which they want linked to the release of hostages. Until now, the United States has blocked any Security Council texts that use the word immediate. In the past few weeks, the Biden administration has increased pressure on Israel. And in a television interview, the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who's currently on a tour of the Middle East, confirmed the shift in position.
Of course, we stand with Israel in its right to defend itself, to make sure that October 7th never happens again. But at the same time, it's imperative that the civilians who are in harm's way, that we make them a priority, protecting the civilians, getting them humanitarian assistance.
Well, Karen von Hippel is Director General of the Defence and Security think tank, the Royal United Services Institute, and before Rusi, she worked for the State Department, the American equivalent of the Foreign Office. Karen, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Is this a significant moment?
It's hugely significant. It really just tells you how much frustration has been building up in the Biden administration. They've been putting a lot of pressure on the Netanyahu government behind the scenes for some time, and that hasn't worked because of the enormous numbers of civilian casualties, the destruction, etc. They still are saying publicly they support Israel's right to self-defense, but they are now saying this is just going too far.
Right. So what difference will it make then to have, I mean, because I assume you have the United States behind this, everybody else will come behind it too, because for many of them it's where they were already.
Well, some countries are ahead of the United States. Ireland and Canada, I think, voted to stop sending weapons in the future to Israel. But I think this resolution should get support at the Security Council. Whether or not the United States cuts off weapons sales to Israel is a separate question. But I do think it's important that this is happening now. It's getting mired in the U.S. domestic political issues with the campaign underway. And you heard yesterday Donald Trump and Republicans calling the Democrats people who hate Israel, and Schumer retaliates and says Trump is anti-Semitic. It's getting dragged into U.S. domestic politics. But I do think, even though that is an issue for Biden, his overriding concern is that the war ends soon and that Israel is able to defend itself.
Okay, but so where do we get to in terms of what difference it will make? Could this Security Council resolution make a difference? Does it have to be the United States that actually saying we're not going to send weapons that would make the difference?
Yeah,
Netanyahu?
it does have to be the United States. I don't know if it'll make a difference with Israel. I think Israel is intent on going into Rafah, despite the fact that there's now 1.4 million civilians or so there, many of which moved there from the north when they were evacuated. It's pretty frightening to think that you've had to evacuate your home several times and move to different places. So it's hard to say, because the problem with Netanyahu is that he, of course, his own political survival is at stake as well. And so it's really hard to disentangle what his own interests are with, what his government is. And we do know it's a very right-wing government, and And many of the members of that government are not open at all to a two-state solution either.
Karen von Hippel, thank you very much. This time last week, we were talking about death after England's health ombudsman suggested that as a society we need to get better at planning for it and talking about it. And we had some wonderful emails to the programme, quite a few mentioning death cafes, and all supportive of what someone from St Christopher's Hospice called death literacy. In The Guardian today, the broadcaster Adrian Charles writes about the death of his dad 12 days ago, and how he has been rocked by something inevitable and timely. He was on 5 Live as usual this morning, but told us he couldn't trust himself to address it live on air. He did, though, kindly talk to us before that.
I've just been shocked at how shocked I have been once it did happen. You know, I thought I'd be prepared. I thought, in a way, it'd be more of a disaster if it carried on longer. Yet I'm still just so shocked. And I thought, well, why is that? And it's like your item last week said, we just don't talk about it enough.
So when did he die? How long ago?
It was a week last Saturday. And, you know, I got a call on the Friday, went to the hospital where he was, about 3 hours away from me, and I was there with him for a bit on my own, and by now he was basically not conscious, but was he conscious, wasn't he? I don't know. It's one of the things, I didn't know enough about it. And then, you know, by the following day, all my family were there, my mum and my brother and his wife, and the inestimable advantage we had is that my brother's wife is a GP and a brilliant one and kind of knows the ropes, you know, and so without her to negotiate that final day, I suppose the nurses at the place would have stepped in and they would have been great, but you know, we had her, but you know, very few people have got doctors in the family. We just need to be sort of just more prepared.
In what way? What could people be talking about so that it isn't the shock that you talk about?
I'm still in that appalling hiatus between death and funeral. Yeah, so my thoughts are sort of half formed. You know, I had a real strong teenage memory of at my friend's house watching the cremation of Indira Gandhi in accordance with Hindu ritual in 1984, this was. And I was 17, and I remember watching it on the television where, you know, her body in plain sight, no coffin or anything, is cremated, you know, consigned to the flames, as the newspaper reports all phrased it. I was horrified. I was horrified seeing this, you know, this body burnt. And my friend's dad said, no, I disagree. We was watching it on the telly at my friend's house, and he said, no, I disagree. He said, you know, I was 40-something when I saw my first dead body, and that was my father. And what preparation, you know, had our culture given me for that? And then I was at the age of 57 in the same situation. I don't know what the answer is, but it's, you know, I know there's a question. I don't know what the answer.
I mean, the grief, though, is associated with who your father was and what he meant to you.
Yeah.
And that's how do you ever prepare for that?
I just don't know. And I mean, it struck me that in our work as journalists, if you think about it, the majority of stories we do concern unusual deaths, as in not usual deaths. People dying in unusual, usually tragic ways. That's what we do for a living. And society in general, we focus on unusual deaths, you know, and that's quite right. But I think we tend to forget, I'd certainly kind of forgotten that Commodore Garden had a good innings type deaths of aged parents are absolutely awful too, you know, and I can't speak for everyone, but I think, just thinking back to my assumptions before this happened, I think that was kind of in my mind, and there's always a sense, well, it's wrong to grieve, you know, in a way that I might feel it's a bit wrong to grieve, you know, too much if my dog died or something. I slightly felt like that. I said, well, hang on.
What,
you know,
self-indulgent? You're not allowed to?
Almost self-indulgent. Well, nobody's saying you're not allowed to, but then, you know, how am I supposed to bawl my eyes out to my friend, you know, who lost his brother when his brother was a teenager, who's, you know, a particular friend from university came to mind when I first met him at the age of 19 when we started university together, and one of the first conversations we had, he told me that his dad had just died then. So I almost hesitated to let them know that my dad had died, because it almost felt like an indulgence. Look, this is my stinking thinking, I know, but I think there's something there.
But it's interesting, because one of the things that we had a few emails and messages on social media talking about death cafes, which are quite a thing, where people can go and talk about death, because talking about your loved one is sort of what you want to do.
Yes, I think on that, I think I'm all right, because obviously I'm kind of an oversharer because I'm on here now and I've written about it and so on, but I think that is important. But that kind of isn't my issue, but but again, I'm still learning stuff about myself and sort of about him, because upon death you immediately have to, when you go back, you're looking through photos, you know, for a kind of a memorial and so on. So you're immediately transported through the whole journey of life, and it's just massive. Look, this isn't new news, I know, but it's just something, you know.
You're in the throes of it.
You're in the throes of it, but for entirely obvious reasons. You don't want to go there in your mind, because you kind of don't want it to happen. So we've sort of got to force ourselves to, I suppose.
Adrian Charles on death. Just a reminder of our headlines before we go. A new report has called for women who lost out when their pension age rose from 60 to 65 to receive compensation. The Parliamentary Ombudsman criticised the way the changes were communicated. The Department for Work and Pensions says it will consider the findings. And the Bank of England has held interest rates unchanged at 5.25%. PM will be here as usual at 5 o'clock this afternoon. I'm Sarah Montague, and that's the world of 1:45.
Studio direction was by Alicia Thirsting. The editor was Tom Baker. Now on Radio 4, Child with India Rakison.
It's 1914, and pregnant New Yorker Charlotte Carmody has decided to take a ship all the way to Germany to give birth in a place that she's heard a lot about.
You were pampered, there was no pain, and next thing you knew, a healthy baby was in your arms.
Oh, wow. This is historian Dr. Randy Hutter Epstein, author of Get Me Out, A History of Childbirth from the Garden of Eden to the Sperm Bank.
And she thought, I'm getting on a boat and I'm going there.
In the early 1900s, two German doctors, Bernhard Kronig and Karl Gauss, devised a whole new way to give birth, and they called it twilight sleep. Sounds dreamy, right?
There's two versions of the story. There's the version that she ends up telling in a popular women's magazine.
And then there's the quite stark reality. Here is what it involved.
It's a combination of two drugs, scopolamine and morphine. They provided analgesia, some pain relief, amnesia, you forgot about it.
Right.
But they didn't provide the anesthesia, what we think of today as being completely blocked from pain.
And so, once the drugs are kicked in,
the doctors basically put you in a straitjacket. The bed that you gave birth in looks more like a baby's crib. And they also sometimes put like gags in your mouth because the women were thrashing and they wanted to make sure you didn't wake up with bruises on your arms and you didn't bite your tongue.
Then before the mist, they hid everything away and put a baby in your arms. No memory of the pain, the struggle, the gag. Twilight sleep became hugely popular among wealthy women in New York, spurred on by the first wave of feminism. Women who might have been out demanding the right to vote were demanding to be relieved of the pain of childbirth. For them, it was a choice they wanted to make about their experiences and their bodies. And so clinics were set up in the city. Inexperienced doctors began to administer the drugs. And while the majority of doctors were worried about the practice, they were patronising. They didn't listen.
Because the doctors were like, these women are so stupid. No one wants to hear that. You're not going to win over women saying, you don't understand medicine, you don't understand what you're doing. I think if there were a better conversation, maybe the women would have listened more carefully to what the doctors were warning them.
Twilight sleep turned out to be a flash in the pan. Women started reporting horrible reactions. The drugs caused hallucinations and suppressed important physiological processes like uterine contractions. It also impaired newborn breathing. And then Charlotte Carmody herself tragically died during twilight birth, though reportedly unrelated to the drugs. Anti-twilight sleep campaigns sprung up, and by 1916 the practice had faded. But its rise and its fall encapsulates something crucial about pain in childbirth and what it means.
The next feminist wave, as we know, then came for drug-free births. And then women were pushing back against the doctors who wanted to use the drugs. So I think the pendulum definitely goes back and forth.
Yeah, but it always in some way seems to be about control, right?
It's always about control.
Always,
and
yeah.
I think it's always about a reflection of the relationship that people feel with their doctors.
I'm India Ackerson, and from BBC Radio 4, you're listening to Child. Episode 14. Pain. So let's begin by taking a look at what might be happening inside the body in the later part of a physiological labour. After some hours, possibly even days, endorphins, the body's own painkillers, might be running high, while the contractions of the uterus, the main source of intense feelings and pain, are likely to be regular and powerful. You might hear it called established labour, but midwife and author Rachel Reed calls this the liminal phase.
So women, when they're in this liminal phase, will often look stoned because they're kind of in this sleepy, inward focus state. The top of the uterus, which is called the fundus, gathers up the muscle fibers. It kind of pulls them up like it's kind of pulling on a jumper. And then as it's kind of pulling it up, it pulls it up over the baby's head. And if the baby's head is there, then that holds the cervix open. We've got the amniotic sac that bulges into the vagina during contractions and gently opens the cervix, so it holds it open and it helps it to stretch.
All of this opening, the pulling up of the uterus, the stretching of the cervix, causes those incredibly intense period-like pains. It can, again, take many hours or even days for the cervix to fully dilate. But once it does, the baby starts to descend.
And it's often around this time that the amniotic sac ruptures and lubricates the vagina and the vulva, because the baby's close to coming.
I'm so aware, writing this, that pain is a really naughty word. It's powerful, and it's useless at the same time. It's a vital signal when we use it, but it's also limited in what it can say and describe. Many people choose to avoid the word pain altogether in childbirth, referring to surges or intensity, which can, for some, be really helpful psychologically. But being able to talk about pain is also critical. And in Western culture, that pain has been mythologized, even glorified. In antiquity, pain was a duty to go through, a battle to be fought. For Eve, it was a punishment. But has the pain ever been considered in some way beneficial? Well, in the 13th century, a monk called Bartholomeus Anglicus, or Bartholomew the Englishman, had a theory. Here's Dr. Eleanor Cleghorn, historian and author of Unwell Women.
He argued that the more a woman suffers during the experience of giving birth, the more she loves her child and wants to nurse it and tend it.
How much do you think the pain myth of Eve and thinking like Bartholomew Anglicus, how much do you think that pervades today?
I can't think of another form of human pain that is as moralised as childbirth pain. This kind of symbolic weight. I wonder sometimes whether it's because birth means the continuation of the human race and birth is so painful, it's almost as if as humans we've had to concoct a purpose for it in order to make it okay that as humans we go through it.
Bartholomew's ideas didn't stay locked in the 13th century. Pain relief wasn't sanctioned by the Pope until 1956, but when he did do it, in his address he said that when there was pain, it was the result of the woman's faulty psychic or physical behaviour. And it doesn't stop there. As Lucy Jones points out in her book Matrescence, the chief executive of the National Childbirth Trust said in 2008, if we just dropped babies like eggs, what would that say about the responsibilities we're taking on for the next 20 years? Birth marks you out as a mother and a carer for a very long time. The choice to experience childbirth without drugs is, of course, an important part of autonomy. But let's be clear, using drugs or not does not a better mother make. And the feelings about the pain of childbirth being a woman's lot are pervasive. But for some, more than others. Rachel Ibikunle is a research midwife studying maternal inequalities. She's interested in how racism contributes towards the ethnic disparity in maternal mortality, as well as other outcomes in the UK.
The most striking thing for me was these beliefs about pain, that we still have these assumptions that black women, Asian women, either have higher or lower pain thresholds than a white woman, that we don't just see pain for pain and we're second guessing it based on the colour of their skin.
And making assumptions about pain can mean that something potentially life-threatening is missed.
Hemorrhages would present with pain, potentially DVTs.
That's deep vein thrombosis, which can lead to pulmonary embolism.
It can be a flag to something much more